He was a king who changed the course of a nation. He broke with the Pope, reshaped the church, and sent two of his wives to the executioner's block. But behind the grandeur, the power, and the terrifying reputation, what was Henry VIII like as a father? Was he the loving parent he claimed to be, or a manipulative tyrant who saw his own children as little more than pawns in a game of dynasty and power? Hi, I am Dr. Amy Boyington, and today we're diving into the tumultuous and often heartbreaking relationships between King Henry VIII and his three surviving children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. And we'll also meet the one illegitimate son he openly acknowledged, a boy who could have changed everything. Our story begins with a celebration. On the 18th of February 1516, Henry VIII and his first wife, Katherine of Aragon, welcomed a daughter, Princess Mary. For a king so desperate for a son, his reaction might surprise you. Henry doted on his baby girl. He called her the greatest pearl in the kingdom. Mary was raised as a princess of England, heir presumptive to the throne. She was given a magnificent household, a world-class education, and was paraded around Europe as a prize on the marriage market. But, as we know, this idyllic childhood was built on the foundation of sand. Because for all his love, Henry's obsession with the male heir never waned. The moment Anne Boleyn entered the scene and captured the king's heart, Mary's world began to crumble. Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, what he called his great matter, turned his beloved daughter into a political enemy. The new king's pearl was now seen as a symbol of defiance. As Henry broke from the Catholic Church to marry Anne, he demanded that everyone, including his own daughter, swear an oath acknowledging his new marriage and his new title as supreme head of the Church of England. Mary, who was fiercely loyal to her mother and her Catholic faith, absolutely refused. This is where the story turns really sad, because in 1533, Henry had his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, and a new Act of Succession was passed. In that act, it declared his daughter Mary an illegitimate bastard. At just 17 years old, she was stripped of her title, her household, and her dignity. And here's a truly chilling detail. When Anne gave birth to her own daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, it was Mary who was forced to be a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister. Can you imagine her humiliation? A grown woman, once a princess, now reduced to a servant for a baby who had usurped her place in the line of succession. For 3 agonizing years, Henry tormented Mary, separating her from her mother and threatening to have her executed for treason if she did not capitulate. In letters to her, he called her his worst enemy in the world. It was only after Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 and the intervention of his new wife, Jane Seymour, that Henry and Mary were finally reconciled. To save her life, Mary was forced to acquiesce, signing a document that recognised her own illegitimacy and acknowledging the fact that her mother's marriage was invalid. She also had to accept that Henry was the head of the church. The emotional and psychological toll on Mary was immense, and it would forever shape her reign as queen. Next, we move on to Henry VIII's second surviving child, Elizabeth. When Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter on 7th of September 1533, Henry was furious. His dream of a male heir had been shattered, and his public reaction was one of bitter disappointment. The birth of Elizabeth was a clear sign that God had not blessed his second marriage. Elizabeth's early life was therefore one of constant precarity. When she was just 2 years old, her mother was executed on trumped-up charges of treason, incest, and adultery. The charges were, to put it mildly, a thinly veiled excuse to get rid of Anne and allow Henry to remarry for a third time. But the result was catastrophic for the little Elizabeth. Like her older sister, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her royal title. She was now simply the Lady Elizabeth. For the rest of her childhood, she lived in a state of political limbo, her fate hanging by a thread. She was essentially a bastard with a claim to the throne, which made her a valuable yet dangerous commodity. Unlike Mary, Elizabeth was too young to really remember her mother, and therefore had no strong allegiance to a rival queen. This, along with her quiet intelligence and adaptability, allowed her to navigate the treacherous Tudor court. By all accounts, Henry was proud of his youngest daughter's intellect, even if he rarely saw her. He made sure she had the best tutors and received an education that was exceptional for any royal child, let alone a girl. A turning point came with Henry's final wife, Catherine Parr. As a stepmother, Catherine was a gentle and stabilising force in Elizabeth's life. She worked tirelessly to reconcile the king with both of his daughters. Henry passed the Third Succession Act, which restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, though still placed behind their younger brother Edward. It was a significant step, but it could not erase the emotional trauma of Elizabeth's childhood. She had learned early on that a king's love was conditional and that her very existence was tied to political unity. This hard-won knowledge would serve her well when she eventually became queen. On October the 12th, 1537, a cannon salute echoed across London. After decades of waiting, Henry VIII had a son. Prince Edward was born to Jane Seymour, the wife Henry called his most loyal and beloved. Henry's joy was unbridled. He referred to Edward as this whole realm's most precious jewel. Every child was a jewel when they were in his favour. The birth of a healthy male heir was seen as a divine blessing, a sign from God that finally he approved of the king's actions. But this triumph came at a great cost. Just 12 days later, Jane Seymour died. Henry was heartbroken, but he was also left with a new all-consuming project, raising his son. Edward's household was a fortress of cleanliness and security, with Henry demanding exacting standards to protect his precious boy. Edward was apparently a prodigy, intellectually precocious, fluent in Greek and Latin, and a devout Protestant. But that was no different from Elizabeth. His father was immensely proud of his son's mind. While Henry did undoubtedly love his son, he was often a distant father, more concerned with the idea of a male heir than the day-to-day reality of raising a boy. I don't think Henry changed any diapers or nappies. By the time Edward was a boy, Henry was a physically broken man, and his interactions with his son were limited. Edward's upbringing was heavily influenced by the Protestant faction at court, which would have a profound impact on his short reign after his father's death. Henry, for all his radical religious changes, remained Catholic at heart. The strict Protestant faith that his son espoused would have likely created a great deal of conflict between them had Henry lived to see Edward grow into an adult king. Finally, we must also discuss Henry FitzRoy. In the quest for a legitimate male heir, Henry VIII's life was also marked by a fascinating side story, the rise and fall of his illegitimate son, Henry FitzRoy. In 1519, while still married to Katherine of Aragon, Henry fathered a son with his mistress, Elizabeth Blount. Henry's reaction to this birth was not one of shame, but of immense pride. This was proof that he was capable of producing sons. In a truly scandalous move, Henry openly acknowledged the child as his own, something that he didn't do for any of his other illegitimate children, or suspected illegitimate children. And on the 18th of June, 1525, Henry FitzRoy, a boy of just 6, was brought to court for a lavish ceremony. In one day, he was created Earl of Nottingham and Duke of Richmond and Somerset, the highest-ranking peer in the kingdom after the king himself. Henry was said to love the boy like his own soul, and gave him an income and household befitting a prince. This was a clear public signal that Henry was grooming this boy for a possible future as his successor, especially given the lack of a living male heir with Catherine. This wasn't just a father's pride, it was a political masterstroke. The titles of Duke of Richmond and Somerset were highly significant. They were titles held by his father and grandfather, the founders of the Tudor dynasty. This was as close as Henry could get to naming an illegitimate child as his heir without legalising it. Henry FitzRoy was given a magnificent education, and he was even sent to France to study at the court of King Francis I, a prestigious opportunity usually reserved for the sons of kings. But just as his future seemed brightest, the young man's story came to a sudden, tragic end. In 1536, at the age of just 17, Henry FitzRoy died of what was likely tuberculosis. Henry VIII was distraught, and his dreams of an heir were dashed yet again. Some historians believe that had Henry FitzRoy lived, the king, his father, might have found a way to legitimise him, possibly as a compromise solution to the succession crisis. His untimely death paved the way for Edward, and it left the path to the throne open to Henry's surviving legitimate children. Henry VIII's legacy as a father is a complicated one. He was capable of great affection, yet he was also a man who put his own political and personal needs before the well-being of his children. He was cold, he was distant, and he was awfully cruel at times. His obsession with a male heir defined their lives from the moment the children were born. Henry declared both of his daughters illegitimate and stripped them of their titles, a traumatic experience that would mark them forever. He gave his illegitimate son more power and love than he gave to his own daughters at times, only to lose him in a stroke of brutal bad luck. But Henry finally did get that son, only to die before he could see his son grow up. The irony of Henry's life is that for all his brutal manipulation, his last will and testament, which restored Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, set the stage for two of England's most powerful and iconic female leaders. A king who spent his whole life trying to produce a male heir would ultimately be succeeded by two women he had once cast aside. It is perhaps the greatest and most fitting twist of fate in the entire Tudor dynasty. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, as ever, please like, share and comment, and I shall endeavour to create some more.